So I now have the great pleasure and privilege of introducing the star of the evening, Janet Dawson. Janet Dawson is a discerning art collector, passionate historian, inventive chef, and gifted storyteller who currently divides her time between Toronto and Tepoztlan, Morelos, Mexico. Born and educated in England, Janet has an MA in art history from Birkbeck College, University of London, England, a diploma in modern art studies from Christie's Education, London, and was in the first group of docents at Tate Modern in London when it opened in 2000. She has given talks on art and all sorts of related matters, whether it be tennis, the Day of the Dead, dogs. She has a wide repertoire of how to incorporate art into life. And she's given these talks in Canada, England, Mexico, Switzerland, and the United States. While Janet and Doug were living in Dallas and later in Washington, D.C., Janet opened an art gallery showcasing artists from Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Three of Janet's great passions are art, Mexico, and food. She was able to combine these during her tenure as scholar in residence at the cooking school Cocinar Mexicano in Tepoztlan, where she gave presentations on the roles of food and tradition in Mexican art. So that was all from her official CV, and a very impressive CV it is, but there is so much more, as there always is. To walk into Janet and Doug's home in Tepoztlan is to walk into an art museum, but the most welcoming and eclectic art museum imaginable. Its bright colors and expertly curated collection embrace you. Delightful discoveries await at every turn. Fine art is intermingled with folk art. A Botero statue has pride of place near the front entrance, as does a shower curtain imprinted with the Virgin of Guadalupe in the guest washroom. And therein lies the enchantment. In an item which some might see as kitschy, a Virgin of Guadalupe shower curtain, Janet sees history, culture, story, and art. She can tell you the most fascinating backstories for each item in her extensive collection, about how she procured it, about the artist or artisan, although I'm not sure Janet would differentiate between the two. My impression is that wherever Janet looks, she sees life as art and art in life. She has a contagious enthusiasm and generosity of spirit, creating and sharing beauty and oh so delicious food with those around her. And best of all, she has the gift of storytelling, a gift with which she can draw the rest of us into a way of viewing the commonplace around us and see that it is not so commonplace at all. So without further ado, please welcome Janet Dawson.
Let me set the record straight. As much as I would like it to be a Botero statue, in fact, it's a piece of artisania that Botero did give his permission for some artisans in Colombia to create dolls based on some of his work. And so what we have in the front hall is a businessman, and then in the guest bathroom, which we call the Virgin of Guadalupe bathroom, we have a bishop. Let me start with these quotations. The first one, Mary Wollstonecraft, the highest branch of solitary amusement is reading. The second one, and remember that name, for some of you, it may be very familiar. The second one, when I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. Jane Austen. Thirdly, reading was my first solitary vice and led to all the others. I read while I ate, I read in the loo, I read in the bath. Germaine Greer, the great Australian feminist. And a well-read woman is a dangerous creature. This is by Lisa Kleypas, who was born in 1964 and is the very successful author of those bodice-tearing historical romances that have been very favorably reviewed by the New York Times. and she was also a Miss Massachusetts in 1995. And her expression, her statement, "A well-read woman is a dangerous creature," you're able to get this journal with it on the front. You can also buy it as a coffee mug. So I found it interesting that in 2023, a well-read woman is still considered to be something of a dangerous creature. And the final one, Margaret Atwood. "I read for pleasure, and that is the moment I learn the most." A few years ago, this large mural was on a wall in Tepoztlan, and after passing it on numerous occasions, I began thinking about how girls and women have been depicted as they're reading, how they've been depicted in art. And I began thinking about it a great deal. The female reader, whether she's naked or clothed, in bed or in the garden, has always fascinated artists. Think of the popularity of the women who read calendars printed every year. But why isn't there a calendar entitled Men Who Read? And if there were, who would buy it? Why is it that the image of a female reader is so much more appealing and beguiling than that of a man? Tonight, you'll be seeing a variety of female readers in a variety of contexts. So this first image on the left is the disc of Enheduanna. She was a Sumerian princess, and she was a remarkable woman who wielded considerable religious and political power. Today, more than 4,000 years after her death, her voice continues to echo down to us. And what is so important about Enheduanna is that she is the first recorded author in world history. A recent exhibition at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City was entitled "She Who Wrote, Enheduanna and Women of Mesopotamia." It highlighted Enheduanna and the importance of other Mesopotamian women, because initially, when some of the reading materials were discovered, some of the written materials on tablets, modern archaeologists and scholars were very dismissive about their importance. So this disc shows her wearing a flounced floral dress. Here she is in the middle. And she's wearing an aga or turban, and she's making an offering to the moon god Inanna. Now, while here she's not shown actually reading, it's known that her literary works comprise temple hymns, poems, and incantations. On the right, we have the poetess Sappho. She's not only one of the few women poets we know from antiquity, but she's also one of the greatest lyric poets of any age. Most of her poems were meant to be sung by just one person to the accompaniment of a lyre, hence the term lyric poetry. Her passionate and erotic poetry, hymns to love and marriage, and goddesses and wedding songs full of yearning were meant to educate her female audience in all matters of the heart and the arts. Some 200 fragments of her work remain, and one complete song. Sappho has been a popular subject throughout history, from antiquity to the present. Plato called her the 10th muse, and her likeness appeared on coins. And here the vessel shows her reading a manuscript. The Annunciation has been one of the most frequent subjects of Christian art, and it appears in the work of Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Caravaggio, Duccio, Jan van Eyck, Murillo, and hundreds of others. After the 12th century, the book was a common element in Annunciations everywhere. And in Simone Martini's golden depiction, Mary appears startled, as though she's seeking refuge in her corner from the power of the angel Gabriel's words. The red book that she's reading, which I think you can see, it's been suggested that it is a book of hours. and it's meant to symbolize her wisdom. These books of hours were private devotional books owned by the wealthy in the late Middle Ages, and they were also used for teaching children to read. Simone Martini's Mary has mastered an art that became the practice of educated women in the late medieval period. And this is a very, very important point, because that art was silent reading, because that enabled her to acquire knowledge of her own accord, and not through obedience, but through private study. So look at the size of this. This is 184 by 210 centimeters, and compare that with the centerpiece of the triptych known as the Marode altarpiece. This is believed to have come from the workshop of the artist Robin Campin. He's thought he is most definitely the first great master of early Netherlandish painting. This Annunciation takes place in a domestic interior, and the centerpiece of a triptych which was intended as a private devotion, because look at the size of it. The piece that we're looking at is only 65 centimeters in height. The Archangel Gabriel has arrived in the room, but the Virgin is absorbed in her reading, and she seems unaware of her heavenly guest. Interestingly, this Mary has a choice of reading material. There's the open book on the table, which underneath you can see a green cloth, and that would be there to protect it. And then there's the one that she's reading, which is believed to be the Old Testament prophecy of a virgin birth in Isaiah. Now, the other thing to note about this is that even though there's a bench that she could be sitting on, that she has chosen to sit on the floor leaning against the bench. So this would be another indication of her humility. Now, I could, of course, spend a lot more time on this, but the very first time I did it as a run-through with Doug, he told me that I spoke far too much. In addition to the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene was frequently portrayed with a book in her hand. From the 13th century, the figure of Mary Magdalene, the sinner and penitent, enjoyed great popularity. But her association with a book doesn't appear before the 15th century. And she is perhaps the most adaptable of all the figures mentioned in the Gospels. After all, she's been venerated as a saint, condemned as a sinner, labeled a prostitute, and even reimagined as Jesus' wife. Now, paintings of young women were often advertisements to attract princely husbands. Ambrosius Benson was an Italian painter who often painted allegorical portraits of women in accordance with contemporary taste. And they included a series of Magdalenes. So for the contemporary observer then, this pretty young woman, gazing devoutly at her book, covered in red velvet, had the allegorical significance of a promise of marriage. Various depictions of penitent Magdalenes over the centuries display a surprising amount of flesh. Almost certainly, this can be read as a manifestation of the male gaze, using an ostensibly pious subject, the subject of a saint, but one which conveniently allows for liberal amounts of nudity. And here we have the German artist Friedrich Heinrich Fugger's version of Mary Magdalene reading. By the way, if you wish, and this is absolutely true, you can order a duvet cover with this image of the penitent Mary on the front. You can also order it as a t-shirt, but the duvet cover seemed more titillating in a way. Perhaps it's the underlying eroticism of the image, coupled with the idea of a penitent religious woman, which is so appealing. Clearly, it's an irresistible combination for some. Now, one art historian has described the expression on this Mary Magdalene's face as being wistful and dreamy. But I absolutely disagree, because for me, this is a woman who's world-weary, even fed up, and really in sharp contrast to José Agustín Arrieta's Magdalena, painted 25 years later. Now, Arrieta was educated and spent most of his life in the city of Puebla in Mexico. He was known as a costumbrista artist, and what that means is that he painted the daily life and customs of the city, and he also painted still lifes. Less outstanding are his religious paintings, which I suggest would include this rather mournful looking, and some of you may be familiar with the expression gormless, a rather gormless looking Magdalena, gazing up into the heavens, her arm concealing, and I have to say her rather chubby arm, concealing whatever it is she's reading. The contrast between these three depictions of Mary Magdalene couldn't be more different. In deeply Catholic Spain, reading and reciting devotional texts remained more central to women's literacy for longer than in the north. Dressed in picturesque costume of a shepherdess and with the features of a contemporary woman, there's nothing otherworldly about Spanish artist Francisco de Zurbarán's painting of St. Margaret of Antioch. And according to one legend, her father, a pagan priest, cast her out when she converted to Christianity, and she was left to fend for herself and told to look after sheep. So here we see her dressed as a shepherdess, and notice the book in her hand and the staff, and she looks very determined and decisive, as though she is going door to door to convince people to start reading the book. And in the bottom left-hand corner of the painting, which is a little hard to see, unfortunately, is a dragon, because the second legend about Margaret of Antioch is that she was asked, the prefect of Antioch asked for her hand in marriage, and she refused, and as a result of that, she was thrown in the dungeon and was devoured by Satan in the form of a dragon. But here, the dragon is accompanying her in an almost protective way. And one reason I wanted to draw your attention to his claw is because if you look at his foot, his claws, and look at her foot, I see a relationship between the two. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz may not be a name that is familiar to many of you. She was a Mexican nun born in 1648 and died in 1695. And she was one of the most successful Novo-Hispanic writers of the 17th century. She's termed the Phoenix of Mexico, and she was highly celebrated in Spanish-speaking literary circles for her dedication to poetry, philosophical musings, religious devotion. She was a poet, she was a dramatist, and she had a formidable intellect. She had an extensive library, and she was also an accomplished cook, who famously maintained that if Aristotle had cooked, he would have written more. In this posthumous portrait, Miguel Cabrera, who was born in Oaxaca in 1695, the year that Sor Juana died, has painted Sor Juana in her study, surrounded by books on various subjects and holding a quill, which represents her status as a writer. And this is what Sor Juana said about learning to read. I was not yet 3 years old when my mother determined to send one of my elder sisters to learn to read at a school for girls. Affection and mischief caused me to follow her. And when I observed how she was being taught her lessons, I was so inflamed with the desire to know how to read that, deceiving the mistress, I told her that my mother had meant for me to have lessons too. I learned so quickly that before my mother knew of it, I could already read. Now, I continue to be disappointed that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz does not appear on more lists of extraordinary women. For example, Judy Chicago's iconic 1979 dinner party, widely regarded as the first epic feminist artwork, functions as a symbolic history of women in civilization. The 39 elaborate place settings on a triangular table for 39 mythical and historical women, but no Sor Juana. Her name, however, does appear on one of the 999 floor tiles, each of which bears a name of these highly regarded women. But I take exception to what was said in the catalogue, where they described Sor Juana as being a talented nun. Talent not being a word that I would associate with her fabulous intellect. And she appears on the 200 peso note in Mexico. Now we're going to move on to images of secular and educated women. Eleanor of Aquitaine was Queen of France from 1137 to 1152, and she was perhaps one of the most powerful, or the most powerful woman in 12th century Europe. Extremely active in politics, both as a wife and mother of various kings. She was 82 years when she died in 1204 and is entombed in Fontevraud Abbey in the Loire Valley in central France. She was highly educated and famous for her wide reading, so what could be more natural than her tomb effigy to show her holding a book? The Book of the City of Ladies. Christine de Pizan, born in 1364 and died in 1430, she was born in Venice, but she spent her life in France. She was well educated in languages, literature, science, and geometry. And she wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in response to Lamenta, which was a tirade against women by the caustic cleric and poet Matthiolus. The women in Christine de Pizan's city are noble through cultivated reading rather than by birth. She asked why women should not receive the same education as men, and why this idea was so abhorrent to them. She discussed the criminality of rape, women's innate political skills, and above all, their natural capacity for reading and study. In this miniature, the three allegorical figures of reason, rectitude, and justice assist de Pizan in constructing a symbolic city of women. And what I particularly like are the bricklayers on the right. You can see them, that they have a trowel and they have whatever the tray is for sifting out the gravel or whatever it is. This portrait is considered by some to be the most fascinating female portrait of this time period. Battiferri's slender figures mark the place in a book of sonnets by Petrarch dedicated to Laura, and it's sonnets to Laura. So Laura Battiferri was herself a distinguished poet, and her literary creations were read and admired by women and men in her intellectual circles. Here we see she's soberly dressed. Her principal adornment is the book of poetry she so prominently displays. And her poetry also attracted keen attention, had keen readers at the royal court in Spain, who had her work translated into Spanish. There was a strong platonic rapport between her and the artist Bronzino. He was a renowned portraitist for the Medici court in Florence. He was also a poet in his own right. Mary Wollstonecraft. She was born in England, 1759, and died in 1797. She argued tirelessly for the rights of women. Her most important work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792, was a bold call for a radically new attitude to women's rights and abilities. And this portrait shows her as if interrupted as work. Now, despite her reputation as an intellectual icon, this was quite remarkable for a time when representation of intellectual prowess was exclusively reserved for portraits of men. Mary Wollstonecraft was the mother of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Wollstonecraft died 10 days after giving birth to her daughter Mary. Mary Shelley was 20 when Frankenstein was published anonymously on January the 1st, 1818. The following appeared in the British Review and London Critical Journal in April of the same year. I quote, "The writer of Frankenstein is, we understand, a female. This is an aggravation of that which is the prevailing fault of the novel. But if our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, it is no reason why we should. And we shall therefore dismiss the novel without further comment." So what was it that men feared about women's reading and writing? A big worry was that it was something that they could do alone, without anyone to guide their thinking. They would learn to think independently. Accordingly, they might cease displaying the attractions, sweetness, soft voices, compliance that were the product of their dependence on male approval. And they might start talking back to men, and indeed they did. Mary Adelaide of France was the fourth daughter of Louis XV. This painting is by the Geneva-born Jean-Étienne Lyotard, who, after living in Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, he lived there for 5 years, he adopted Turkish dress, and he also liked to dress the ladies he painted, who included beautiful readers, in Turkish clothing. So here we see a combination of Ottoman magic and female beauty. And it's a fitting image for you to be looking at when listening to the following. In the late 16th century, one man maintained that the woman who read frivolous books, I quote, would smell of naughtiness all her life after. Some 200 years later, in 1766, James Fordyce, a Scottish Presbyterian minister, exhorted ladies to be gentle and to do what men told them to in his very popular Sermons to Young Women. Now, Lydia Languish is the heroine in the English playwright Richard Sheridan's 1775 play, The Rivals. During one scene, when Lydia hears her elders coming to visit her in her boudoir, she orders her maid, "Here, my dear Lucy, hide these books, quick, quick. Fling Peregrine Pickle under the toilet, throw Roderick Random into the closet, cram Ovid behind the bolster, but please, Fordyce's sermons should be laid open on the table." And in 1791, a teacher named Carl G. Bauer announced that reading would lead to slackness, mucus congestion, flatulence and constipation of the inner organs, which, as is well known, particularly in the female sex, actually affects the sexual parts. The protagonists of this engraving peruse the library shelves in search of forbidden material. Men feared that such books would cause women to imagine a different life for themselves, especially if they were romances or novels. And one London doctor wrote, "Female patients might be allowed fiction, but should be carefully watched. If a novel seems to worsen a woman's condition, it should be taken away and replaced by a book upon some practical subject. For instance, beekeeping." Reading was a pleasure that only a few could attain. During the 18th and 19th centuries, you had to be a girl born to a wealthy family to be granted a basic education. Also, books weren't cheap. Hence, reading as a pastime was not for the common folk. And in some paintings, the book appears as an accessory. It was once a status symbol, so it was rather like showing off the latest version of the iPhone. Now, Phyllis Wheatley, although she was an enslaved person, was one of the best-known poets in pre-19th century America. Born in West Africa, she was kidnapped when she was about 7 years old. She was a slave in the household of a prominent Bostonian called John Wheatley, and the family named her Phyllis after the slave ship on which she arrived in Boston. She was taught to read and write, including Latin, perhaps as a kind of social experiment to discover what effect education might have on an African. She was lionized in New England and England, with her poetry being published in both places. She was 20 when the first edition of Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was published. The first volume of poetry ever by an African American. In this print, she's dressed as a servant or an enslaved person, and she sits at a table holding a quill, her head resting on her other arm, deep in thought, in a pose that suggests creative thought. But if you look around the top, you can see that it says Phyllis Wheatley, a Negro slave in the household of John Wheatley. This image is the first individual portrait of an African woman of African descent, and it was made as the frontispiece for the author's first published book. It's believed that Scipio Moorhead, the artist, was a man of African descent who lived near the author in Boston, and that he created the image. And she is considered to be the founder of African American literature. Sadly, she died when she was just 30 years old, and she died in poverty. William Paxton achieved recognition and popular acclaim for his paintings based on a single theme. And that theme was showing an elegant interior inhabited by a young woman who was as decorative as the still life objects that surrounded her. But here instead we see a uniformed servant engrossed in a book and standing behind a table on which a group of still life objects is displayed. Paxton has painted a servant reading, her feather duster tucked under her arm. He's shown a servant rather than the usual lady of leisure. The Asian still life objects on the table, we need to remember, are the housemaid's responsibility, but they're not her property. And on the right, looking at the various taxidermy, skeletal animal studies, and other curiosities found throughout the scene of this maid reading in the library, also with a feather duster tucked under her arm, one can assume that this is a private one devoted to natural history. More than one art critic has suggested that the maid is reading a novel, rather than one of the scientific volumes found on the shelf. But I would really disagree and argue that this maid is so fascinated by what's on those shelves that she is taking every opportunity to educate herself. The Pack Horse Library Project in Kentucky was established in 1935. Now, what I didn't mention was the image on the poster, and the image that you saw at the very beginning of this talk is called The Bookbinder, and it was painted by Gino Severini, an Italian futurist painter, and it's of his daughter, Gina Severini, who was a bookbinder. And I chose that particular image because of the look of determination on her face, and also, of course, because the book is so prominently displayed. So that was painted the same year as this project began. And this was part of Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration, the WPA. and it was an effort to create jobs for women and bring books and reading materials into Appalachia. This was one of the poorest and most isolated areas in eastern Kentucky, and had few schools, no libraries, and inaccessible roads. The librarians were known as bookwomen, though there were very few men among their ranks. These librarians traveled by horse, mule, sometimes foot, and even rowboat to reach the remotest areas. In the years of the service, more than 1,000 women served in the Packhorse Library Project, and it was reported that nearly 600,000 residents in 30 eastern Kentucky counties were served by them. Nigella Lawson's Cookbook Library. Now, as in addition to art and reading, you've heard that I also like to cook. I had to include this photograph because, and this is what she wrote a dozen years ago about her cookbook library. I decided to take stock, and this week has been Operation Organize. As the titles mounted up, I veered between pride and shame. It is certainly some collection. At close of play today, the total, for now, stands at 3,886 titles. And my question to her is, how does she ever find a recipe? When I first found this image and I was talking about showing it to Doug, and Doug said, well, you have to tell them how many cookbooks you have. So I did count, and I have a measly, I think it's 420. So I'm very far behind. Now let's have a look at women educating children. Chardin, whose still life paintings are among the greatest in art history, painted two versions, almost identical versions, of the little schoolmistress or the young schoolmistress. The earlier one, which you see here, is in the National Gallery in London, and the other one is in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Here we see a young child being taught by an older girl. Perhaps it's the sister or a cousin. And despite the picture's title, this is almost certainly a private lesson taking place at home rather than at school. The book is partly hidden by a sheaf of paper, but if you look, you can see she's got a knitting needle and she's pointing out the words, and the child is also pointing with his or her finger, because I read a number of learned journals where art historians were trying to decide whether or not the child is a boy or a girl, and there seems to be 50-50 that a decision hasn't been made. But these two people belong to perhaps the growing French bourgeoisie, who valued education, especially literacy, which was no longer confined to the nobility and the professional classes. Education was available to girls, even if it was just to prepare them for motherhood and domestic duties. I first gave this talk, Danger Women and Girls Reading, at a fundraiser for Tepots Rosa in Mexico. So I obviously wanted to include a number of examples in Mexican art of women and girls reading. You saw one earlier, the rather mournful-looking Agustin Arrieta's Mary Magdalene. But in all of my books on Mexican art, I came across very, very few images of either women or girls depicted reading. This one, by the Mexican artist Angel Zerraga, he was born in 1886 and he moved to Europe in 1904. And he lived in Paris for more than 35 years. He returned to Mexico in 1941. I mention that because, unlike his contemporaries, such as the great muralist Diego Rivera, Gabriel Orozco, and David Siqueiros, he did not deal with any revolutionary issues. Here, instead, we see a classically dressed woman in blue, who perhaps is meant to symbolize knowledge. And she's teaching English. She's teaching history to an indigenous girl while her mother respectfully looks on. When I looked at this painting more carefully, one of the things that struck me is that the woman who's teaching is dressed in blue, which could be a reference to the Virgin Mary, because in the book, the book on the right, if you look on the right-hand page, there is what appears to be a cross. So whether or not this was Zaraga's subtle way of making a reference to Catholicism, I don't know. But it struck me as something that was quite interesting. This small lithograph by the Mexican artist, great Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, who of course was the husband of Frida Kahlo, shows a young indigenous woman teaching a group of children, a couple of adults, and an old man in the open air, adjacent to a field where campesinos are working. And if you look on the left, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see an armed guard on horseback with a rifle. This piece, Open Air School, references Jose Vasconcelos's project and initiative in the early 1920s after the end of the Mexican Revolution to educate the indigenous community, the indigenous population, because at the start of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, only 10% of the population knew how to read. By 1940, that had increased to 37%, and according to UNESCO statistics in 2022, 94% of Mexican adults are literate. And a sobering photograph. As of December 2022, the Taliban have banned women from universities, sparking international condemnation and despair among young people in the country. The ban further restricts women's education. Girls had already been excluded from secondary schools since the Taliban returned last year. One Afghan woman was quoted as saying, "Afghanistan is not a country for women, but instead a cage for women." UNESCO noted that between 2001 and 2018, the period when the Taliban were not in power, the rate of female attendance in higher education had increased more than 20 times. In the top, we have a wonderful painting by Sir Edward Burne-Jones, and he was one of the most influential and popular artists in 19th century England. And Katie Lewis, who's featured here, was the daughter of close friends. He began this painting when Katie was 4 years old, and he completed it when she was 8. According to many, she was a headstrong, highly intelligent girl with a wicked sense of humor. This painting depicts her as a passionate reader, comfortably sprawled on a sofa, reading the romantic but bloody legend of St. George and the Dragon, not the usual reading matter considered suitable for young girls. And I have to say at this point that it wasn't only men who were worried about what women were reading, because this is what the 19th century English author Sarah Stickney Ellis had to say. "It is scarcely possible to imagine a prudent and judicious mother allowing the unrestricted and private reading of Shakespeare among her children." Below, English artist Ivy Smith's Two Girls Reading. It was painted over 100 years later, and yet here we see the same focused, absolute focused concentration on the two girls reading. And this, the piece on the bottom, I believe, was a commission for either a community centre or a school in England. And let's briefly move on to romance and books. Eloise, who was born in 1100 and died between 1163 or 1164, was a French nun, philosopher, writer, scholar, and a renowned woman of letters. She became a high-ranking abbess in the Catholic Church. achieving approximately the level and potential power, political power of a bishop in 1147. However, she's perhaps more famous in history and popular culture for her torrid love affair with Peter Abelard, her teacher. After the affair was discovered, he was castrated and took holy orders, as did she. Eloise is known for exerting critical and intellectual influence upon his work and posing many challenging questions to him. This watercolor illustration by the wonderfully named Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale was an English artist, and it was from the Golden Book of Famous Women, which was published in 1919. And here we see Eloise working at her desk with Abelard interrupting her creative endeavors, but she really doesn't seem to mind. Paolo and Francesca, the tragic tale of real-life lovers, is recounted in Dante's Divine Comedy, and it's a cautionary tale against succumbing to the sin of adultery. It was a very popular subject for artists in the 19th century, and this rendering by the German artist Anselm Feuerbach shows the two lovers engrossed as they pretend to read a courtly romance about Sir Lancelot. Their eyes modestly cast down, an image of harmony, love, and contemplation. Interior of an artist's studio is one of the very few, and I also found this very interesting, one of the very few representations in the history of 19th century Mexican art depicting a woman painter. Josefa and Juliana San Roman are considered to be among the most outstanding painters in 19th century Mexico. And here we see a woman standing in front of an easel. To her left is another woman reading, while a third observes the scene. The painting is thought to be of Josefa with her sisters Juliana and Maria de Jesus. But notice the religious matter on the easel and on the walls. Through such images, Josefa is letting us know that she and her sisters are devout Catholic women. The sister with the open book on the right is perhaps reading aloud from a religious text. Doña Juanita Quezada. Portraits were Mexican artist Hermenegildo Bustos' claim to fame. He always worked in small formats, such as with simple materials, such as sheet zinc, since most of his sitters were of modest means. In his portrait of Doña Juanita, we see a stern, rather forbidding woman, whose choice of reading material appears to be religious. This is not a woman who's been carried away by a frivolous novel or a piece of romantic fiction. Indeed, she's showing us that she's a devout, upright, and conservative member of the community, with no time to waste on idle reading, so she would have been most unhappy if she had seen this. Now, interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, there's quite a high proportion of paintings of nude or partially nude women reading. But isn't it interesting that you rarely come across a painting of a nude man reading? Why women then? There could be three possible explanations. The first is that female nudity was ubiquitous in art, with or without books. Number two, their nakedness could be a symbol of their vulnerability as they're engrossed in a world of fiction and sentimentality. And thirdly, it's likely that some of the artists wanted to draw an erotic connection between the increasingly popular and kitschy romantic fiction and women readers, especially when they depicted them nude with books in their hands. The reading girl caused a mild sensation when the French artist Theodore Roussel displayed this very large, almost square painting at the New English Art Club in 1887. One critic wrote, No human being, we should imagine, could take any pleasure in such a picture as this. It is a degradation of art. However, another one was impressed by the model's firm and youthful figure. The subject is not presented as a classical Venus, but rather as a robust and healthy young woman. Notice the discarded kimono hanging on the back of the campaign chair, and notice her hair. And she looks as though she's reading a magazine. She's completely comfortable in her nudity, in her nakedness. Her name was Hetty Pettigrew, and she was the model of the artist for more than 30 years, from the time that she was 17 until he remarried in 1914. So one assumes that his second wife did not want him painting naked women anymore. Suzanne Valadon received no formal artistic training. She taught herself to draw by watching artists and also being a model for such artists as Toulouse-Lautrec and Renoir. She finally liberated the female nude and is known for her expressive and naturalistic women. This woman is completely relaxed, comfortable, as she reads either a novella or a pamphlet. And it's been suggested that she is a sex worker, that she was a prostitute, and that she's perhaps waiting for her next client. If that is indeed the case, she's clearly enjoying what she's reading. In the weeks before Christmas 1903, the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch had been working on a commission, but tensions arose between him and the patron, and the fact that Munch chose to spend Christmas in a brothel increased them, as did Munch's alcohol consumption. In this painting, if you look towards the back on the green bench, we can see Munch crouching there. While at the front, we see the madam dressed in her best clothes, her decent clothes, smoking, and behind her are two of her girls, also very respectably dressed. She's clearly engrossed in what she's reading, and one wonders perhaps whether it's a Christmas story. Angelina Beloff was the first wife of Diego Rivera. And she was born in St. Petersburg and moved to Paris in 1909, and she married Diego Rivera in 1911. And she was also an artist, but because of the couple's financial difficulties, she worked at various jobs, sacrificing her own creative development so her husband could paint. The painting showing her seated with a book in her hand has been described as like looking at the reflection in a broken mirror, where the background and figure, interior and exterior, cease to be separate elements. The painting becomes a complex puzzle to be solved in the viewer's gaze. And this was during Diego Rivera's Cubist period, and for a year, from 1913 to 1914, Diego Rivera and Picasso were good friends, but then they had a falling out because Rivera accused Picasso of stealing some of his ideas. Now, whether or not that's the case, we don't know. And speaking of Picasso, this was painted in 1935, so the same year that the Packhorse Library project began, and the same year as the Bookbinder painting at the very beginning. So it shows Marie-Thérèse Walter, whom Picasso had met when she was 17, and seated at a table reading. Picasso had started a series of one or two women reading in around May 1934. From the mid-1930s, his pictorial language had become more expressive and more radical, with little regard for any obligatory style. And his visual vocabulary comprised stylized spatial disruptions, deformations of natural forms, and dramatic color choices. I deliberately positioned these two images of women reading together because each shows such focused concentration. On the left, the old woman reading a Bible, which is also known as Rembrandt's mother, and we know that she's reading a passage about Jesus' arrival in Jericho, an episode from St. Luke. Both her face and the page are brightly illuminated and rendered in absolutely exquisite detail. The artist was Gerard Dou, who for 3 years was an apprentice in Rembrandt's workshop in Leiden. And when Rembrandt moved to Amsterdam, Gerard Dou became the most important artist in Leiden. In the 17th century, Leiden was a city of intellectual freedom, and it was also the center of book printing. Literacy was fairly widespread, and women enjoyed a basic education. But at the time this painting was executed, their reading activities were still largely limited to religious texts. And on the right, we have this marvelous photograph of Marilyn Monroe reading Ulysses by the photographer Eve Arnold. When the book Reading Women was published in England in 2006, a variety of women authors were asked to choose their favorite picture. The novelist Jeanette Winterson chose this photograph of Marilyn Monroe. And this is what Winterson said about it. "This is sexy precisely because it's Marilyn reading James Joyce's Ulysses. She doesn't have to pose. We don't even need to see her face. What comes off the page, off the photo, is the absolute concentration, and nothing is sexier than absolute concentration. There she is, the goddess, not needing to please her audience or her man, just living inside the book." Sylvia Plath was, for both English and American poetry, one of the defining voices of the 20th century, and one of the most appealing. Few other poets at that time had introduced as many new readers to poetry as she did. But Sylvia Plath was also an artist, but she'd been dissuaded from pursuing an artistic career by critical teachers and peers. And although she refocused her energies on writing, she continued to utilize various visual sources as a source of personal gratification. But it was also to illustrate, to inspire, and to shape her writing. Drawings and drawing deepened her knowledge of what she saw, transforming intellectual understanding into physical experiences. So for me, it seemed fitting that this particular watercolor painting depicting two women reading is by a woman and by a poet. On the left, Mrs. Dufy seated on a striped sofa after Mary Cassatt. And on the right, The Kindle Gazer after Lily Cabot Perry. I like the humor in these two pieces by the American artist Mike Licht. He also painted the Italian poet Laura Battiferri, whose portrait you saw earlier. And what he did there, instead of her holding the book of sonnets, Petrarch's sonnets to Laura, he has her holding an iPad. And to finish with these two images seems fitting in light of what Zoe Williams, a columnist with the Guardian newspaper in England, wrote. "We're a nation of scrollers, not readers, but it's tech billionaires' fault. Stop feeling guilty about not reading books. Netflix and Twitter really are to blame. So stick it to the men by reading a chapter a day. Nobody ever broke off from reading War and Peace to buy a new set of saucepans." And finally, nice, but as long as they're readers, there will be scrolls. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming this evening and supporting Tepos Grossa. Thank you.